Mirrors by Greensearcher, Chapter 17, Flashback. A ladybug crawled slowly along at the child's pinky nail, seeming perfectly at ease, while two wide eyes stared, unfocused, in wonder.
Saucy!
The insect's legs tickled the girl's skin, and she smiled. Her eyes were pale green, hidden beneath a milky surface that was so dense the colour was nearly indistinct from the surrounding white of the eye. The girl tugged absently at her matted blonde hair, pulled back with a bit of string in haste that morning by the child's mother, before she tended to the other 7 children. The day was warm, the palace gardens bursting with life as trees fresh with young leaves and rows of flowers opened to their full summer bloom. The girl, however, found much more enjoyment in the pleasant smells she could bring close to her nose, or the little details she could feel on the tip of one finger.
Saucy, where are you?
The child finally heard the call, looking up quickly as a man in heavy boots moved towards her. The ladybug flew off with the motion, and Circe frowned.
Good Lord, child! How many times do I gotta tell you not to run off?
Sorry, Papa.
He sighed. It's bad enough you can't see me from 3 paces away, Circe. What'll happen if I can't see you? She shrugged. Come on, I could use your help with the rose bushes.
She nodded obediently, reaching out for the edge of her father's loose shirt and following his solid form through the winding paths of the long rows of roses that lined the castle's open courtyard. She breathed in deeply. It smelled wonderful in here.
There,
he said. She felt a thin stick being pressed into her hands.
Start gathering those trimmings. I'll be finishing up on ahead. Think you can manage this, at least?
Circe nodded again, crouching low and feeling for the dead foliage her father had left along the path. The thorns cut her skin, but she didn't mind. It was worth the work just to smell the sweet, lingering scent of the roses, to feel the occasional soft petal beneath her fingertips that had fallen from the plants. Still, it was too much being so close to the bushes themselves. She stopped after some time to admire one more closely. Squatting low, she carefully leaned in close to the nearest plant, fingers brushing up its stem and over the flowers in bloom. She stopped at one point, feeling a young flower near its base. It was smaller than the others, and as far as she could tell, didn't quite fit with the shape of the bush. Papa must have missed one, she decided, though in her heart she knew she was seeking any excuse to pluck a rose of her own. It was all she had ever wanted, after all. Biting her lip, Circe hesitated, looking to the right and left, seeing nothing but the fuzzy greens and reds of the garden. In a second, the rose was torn from its stem. She held it carefully between her fingers and brought it to her nose, and breathing in its sweet scent. She pulled away after a moment, smiling at the infant flower before standing and tucking it into the pocket of her apron. You little thief! Circe gasped, looking around and seeing a shape of deep purple standing on the path. You think those roses are for free for the taking? You think those roses are free for the taking? The voice continued angrily. It belonged to a boy, perhaps a year or so older than her. The prince! Circe realized, falling to her knees in horror. I'm sorry, she whispered, unable to say anything in her defense. He must have seen her tuck the flower into her pocket, and even the garden trimmings were prohibited for the taking. Apologies aren't good enough, peasant, the boy snarled.
What are you doing, Alexander?
A gruff voice called out. Circe bit her trembling lip as another large figure approached. Only one man could address the prince in such a way, and that was the king himself. She stole one of Mother's roses, the prince said fiercely. Circe didn't dare look up, but she could imagine a sharp accusatory finger pointing down at her.
They are just flowers, foolish boy,
the king said harshly,
and I'm certain your dead mother doesn't care about such things anymore.
At that, the prince remained silent.
However,
the king went on,
Fingers that steal roses can just as easily take gold. He paused. Who do you belong to? He asked her.
Circe looked up slowly, body quaking, unable to respond in her fear.
Me, your eminence, a deep voice gasped, kneeling beside her. She's my daughter. An odd-looking thing, isn't she? Those eyes.
The king amused. He snapped his fingers and Circe flinched, but only heard another set of footsteps approach.
Release this man of his duties and find a replacement immediately, the king ordered,
turning on his heel and leaving the scene as quickly as he had come. Serves you right, the prince sneered, following in his father's wake. Circe felt the tears before they came, looking on nervously. Papa! She gasped. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. He was still on his knees, staring absently in the dirt. He was being too quiet for her to know if he was angry or sad, and she couldn't make out his expression.
If we starve, he managed, at last, turning towards her. It'll be your doing, girl. Cursed child. That's what they told me, her father huffed, stomping through the path up ahead of her. You might be half useless, but I never put much stock in superstitions. But maybe I should have listened to him.
He stopped in his tracks, turning towards the quiet forests around them. Circe wrung her hands together, tears staining her cheeks. She brought one corner of her dirty apron to her face to dry them off.
Circe,
he said suddenly. Yes, Papa? He was silent for a long, still moment.
Think you can find us some willow roots for supper?
He asked quietly. She brightened, anxious to help fix what she had broken. Yes, Papa, I can, she agreed, running off into the woods. Behind her, the father watched his child go.
Got enough mouths to feed without you,
he muttered under his breath. He continued down the trail alone. Papa! Circe wandered back towards the trail, hands covered in dirt up to her wrists, apron filled with roots. She had felt fortunate to find them. Much here looked the same to her, but the Arctic willow's low prickly stems made them easy to recognize. Papa, I found them! The forest responded with silence, but for the distant chirping of robins. It was starting to grow dark, and Circe felt her heart slowly rising into her throat. Had she gone the long way? No, Papa always made sure she didn't wander too far. She couldn't see him, but he could always see her. Papa! She called, gripping the corners of her apron tighter and dashing towards the trail. Or at least where she thought the trail had been. Papa, where are you? She ran hard, tripping a dozen times over some unseen growth, meeting tall, looming pines in her path, a dozen more, growing more disorientated and panicked by the minute. It felt like she had been running for miles, but no path appeared beneath her feet.
Cursed child. That's what they told me. Maybe I should have listened to him.
She remembered his words, chest growing as cold as ice. Her grip on her apron loosened, the roots tumbling to the forest floor. Papa, please! She choked out, taking a few more steps, despite the quaking in her legs. I'll be better, I promise! The sun dipped beneath the horizon, coating the forest in cold and darkness. But please, come back! She whispered, fresh tears pooling in her eyes. No one came. She reached into her pocket and pulled the little rose from its hiding place, holding it up in trembling fingers. Gritting her teeth, Circe crushed it in her palms, ignoring the sharp thorns that cut her skin. Falling to her knees, she pressed the ruined flower into the dirt, curling up where she sat, and cried until she had no strength left. And as the sobs gave in to sleep, the earth beside her began to glow. The witch awoke with a start. Her cheeks were wet. Cursing, she brushed them on her sleeve, staring furiously into the darkness. She had been dreaming of that girl more and more often, and she hated it. Yet no spell she had come up with could get rid of the memories. That child was weak and helpless. Someone else. She could never go back to being so utterly worthless. Worth is not gained, Circe. It is inherent. She cursed again, hands flying to her ears as if that would stop the memories of her master's words. That name! Oh! How she loathed it! Her dim-witted peasant mother had thought it a pretty name, not realizing its terrible irony. That Circe was an ancient sorceress, a temptress who changed men into beasts. That this daughter, with the cloudy, unseeing eyes, would be mocked as a thing of misfortune and bad luck by foolish, superstitious people. That even once the blindness was taken from her, her features free to change at will, that she would become everything the name implied. The very curse those fools had predicted. She stood, moving towards the great vanity of the room, lighting the candle with a flick of one hand. An ugly form stared back at her, cheeks hollow, lips cracked, skin grey and lifeless. Her eyes, no longer pale and empty, stared back at her, redder than the roses that grow outside of these very walls. She sucked in a quick breath, and immediately her hair grew voluminous, cheeks flush with colour, face sculpted to her will. The enchantress sighed in relief, staring at her revived beauty. Her true form was growing more hideous with each passing day, and she feared one morning she might wake up and not be able to undo it. Even now, however, her eyes remained that same unnatural red that grew more vibrant with every victim she took. She touched the skin just below them, willing those eyes to change, to brown, to grey, to the green they had once been. Anything else but this colour that was so obviously gave her away. But nothing happened. She sighed in tired frustration. Another area of her training that remained unfulfilled. Why couldn't her magic change this? The eyes tell all. You cannot hide what you are becoming, her master had said sternly, disappointment raging in the older woman's own deep brown orbs. Dark magic always bears a mark, Circe. You must stop this, or it will consume you. The witch frowned. Even her little prince's eyes had remained that same irritating blue, unaffected by her spell. Well, so she couldn't change eyes. It didn't matter. Before year's end, she'd have what she wanted. She stood, brushing her fingers along her chemise, the fabric dissolving into a sparkling red gown, a thick cloak unfolding over her shoulders. Pulling on the hood, she headed towards the door, moving quickly into the depths of her fortress. Fog drifted into the corridors from beyond, halls torn through by cannons and worn down by the elements long ago. With the mist came a powerful scent, a beautiful, enticing one that floated in from the thousands of roses that grew up the outer walls. Guards spotted the halls, their stares blank, that is, until she approached. Then each watched her with hungry eyes, the roses in their vests blooming with life. As you were, she told them. They stiffened, pulling spears to shoulders and resuming their former stances. She had dozens of them here, guarding these walls, guarding 100 more men imprisoned in the old rotting dungeons below. That was where she went now. A kiss from each one. Just a few more recruits. And she'd have enough power to meet her beast.
You're twisting everything I've taught you! Our magic relies on love, Circe, not lust.
The witch scoffed. Love, lust. There was no difference. Her master was just jealous she had found a better, easier way to gain power. Still, it seemed to be taking more men than it used to revive that strength these days. She cursed under her breath. This had grown much more tiresome than she had hoped. It should be so simple, she thought irritably. Let the boy fall into despair, let him grow more and more desperate as the years passed, as all hope of breaking the curse washed away. And then, just when he'd nearly given up hope, turn up on his doorstep in a beautiful body. He'd have fallen for her in a heartbeat. And, if not, one enchanted rose would have made him hers. Now, though, it wouldn't be so simple. She wouldn't embarrass herself by trying that rose trick again. He clearly loved that peasant girl. Curse her beauty, she snarled, stopping before one of the grand mirrors lining these walls. She let her form change then, into one she'd stolen weeks ago. But for her eyes, it was a perfect resemblance. She smiled in satisfaction. Men were heartless, fickle fools. And no peasant girl, no matter how lovely, stood a chance against what she could offer. But, just in case, she touched the glass before her. It dissolved into an image of a man, sitting at the edge of his bed, staring absently at the ground as a single candle burned against the darkness. A worn, wide-brimmed hat hung from the bedpost, old boots abandoned on the floor. The man held a feminine gold band, rubbing it gently between his fingers. Monsieur Dupont, she breathed aloud. This really is your fault, isn't it? Wandering into places you never should have been. Taking gifts that never belonged to you. Maurice, of course, couldn't hear her. He tucked his wife's wedding band into his pocket and let his face fall into his hands. The witch narrowed her eyes, letting the image begin to fade. Yes, this is your doing. And you best hope your great benefactor is willing to be generous to you once again.
I love you.
The words had barely escaped his lips before dying in the quiet air. He had said it. Of course, Adam had known Belle wouldn't hear him. Her breath already slowed to the quiet rhythm of sleep as the words escaped him. Though, at the same time, part of him sort of hoped she had.
Coward,
he told himself, now waking to the soft light of early morning. He knew the words didn't count unless she heard them, and he heard hers in response. Count towards breaking the curse anyway. The thought sent his heart racing, and he was suddenly acutely aware of the warm presence beside him. He looked down. Belle slept on, hands curled into loose fists against him, lips barely parted, hair splayed out in all directions against the sheets. Adam had to fight the grin, deciding he had never seen anything more adorable in his life. He let himself watch her for several long minutes, trying to calm his breathing so the rising of his chest didn't wake her. Soon, however, he heard the stirrings of servants elsewhere in the castle, and realized he should probably leave before he was discovered here. Though surely no one would think anything like that had happened. Not with what she'd just gone through the night before. Not with what he was. How disgusting. Adam frowned, the witch's terrible cackle ringing in his ears. Mocking him. Degrading him. He knew she was just trying to get between him and Belle, that nothing the enchantress said could be trusted. Then why did her words still bother him? He huffed quietly, trying to untangle himself from the sheets without waking Belle. Yet a moment later, the sharp sounds of cloth ripping rang harshly in his ears. Adam froze, curling his toes back, having just torn a hole in the sheets. He swore under his breath. He heard a quiet chuckle, looking back up to see Belle's eyes now open and watching him. He felt some of the blood leave his face. Sorry, I don't, do shoots well, he admitted in embarrassment.
It's okay. Though perhaps you should sleep with your feet outside the covers next time.
Adam had to hide his surprise.
Next time?
He wondered. Something shook the bed then, and Max was soon wrestling his way between them. Adam smiled again, ruffling the fur atop the dog's head. Then he got an idea. Sitting up and pulling back the covers.
Max, look what you've done,
he said, revealing the tear in the sheets and shaking his head in mock disappointment. The dog only cocked his head.
Oh no!
Belle cried, hugging the mutt close to her. Max panted heavily at the attention.
Unfair! He can't even defend himself.
Precisely.
She tried to look stern but just wound up laughing.
You're terrible!
Adam grinned but stopped when Belle began to cough.
Are you alright?
He asked in concern.
She waved it off. Just my throat,
she managed. Adam frowned, recalling the night before in an instant. His eyes fell over the bruises along her throat, which looked even worse in the light of morning. His heart fell into his stomach at the sight of it.
How are you feeling?
He asked quietly. She looked down, realizing her shoulder was still exposed, and quickly pulled her sleeve up.
I'm okay,
she said, tugging her loose robe tighter around her and tucking a bit of mussed hair behind one ear. A mix of anger and regret filled Adam's chest. Suddenly fresh again, once as he thought of what Gaston had done to her. He reached for her hand.
It'll never happen again,
he promised. A faint, almost relieved smile crossed her face, and she seemed to breathe a bit easier. Adam pulled back, tugging on his own robe and grabbing the old ice bags as he stood. Opening one of the windows, he refilled them with fresh snow from the roof before turning back to help Belle resettle.
It's still early. You should try to get some more sleep,
he went on, pulling the blankets back over her. He desperately wanted to stay, but knew it was more important to protect Belle's reputation. For as much as he cared for those who lived here, he knew even the best servants were prone to gossip.
Okay,
she whispered, nestling back down beneath the covers. Max curled up against her feet.
Bye,
she breathed, lids already drooping.
Bye,
he said softly, moving back to the hidden entrance and pulling back the bookshelf. He paused with his paw on the door handle, waiting a long moment as her breathing deepened. Then, so quietly, with only his own ears to guide him, he whispered those 3 words once again, before heading back into the dark passageway. Not an hour later, Adam stood in the armory, gazing up at the rows of swords, muskets, and an assortment of other weapons lining the walls. Like many gentle and well-tempered men, it took great offence to bring him to anger. Yesterday, that requirement was met, and more. Being with Belle, he managed to remain calm, his focus directed at her comfort. Yet, alone, he found it nearly impossible to tame the fury in his chest. Imagining all the ways you could punish Gaston seemed to help a little. He had come up with a good 14 already. That enormous flail in the corner was looking particularly tempting.
15,
he thought, imagining lobbing one of those spiked metal heads straight into Gaston's.
My lord?
Adam turned around. He'd been so lost in his thought he hadn't even heard Henry approach.
I need to stay more alert, he realised.
Henry bowed deeply, then straightened.
My lord, he repeated. I heard what happened. You need me to bring this fellow in? I'll give him a good beating first, too, the man smirked, pounding one fist against the other.
Adam's eyes grew bright.
Yeah, he agreed, starting to grin. Then we scalp him.
May I have the
honour, my prince?
Adam started, realising that the blade nearest the door had been Sir Giles this whole time. You'd think after 10 years he'd be used to this.
Sir Giles? I didn't... What are you doing here? I assume the same as you, my lord.
Ah.
I'll need a description of the offender, Henry went on.
Adam frowned as he turned back to him, but nodded. He tugged the enchanted mirror from his belt.
Show us that bastard,
he said begrudgingly. To Adam's dark amusement, it seemed to know what he meant, and glowed green in response. He held it up quickly to Henry, not sure he could handle seeing Gaston's face. He might be tempted to punch through the glass. Instead, he crossed his arms and looked away.
Whoa!
Henry cried as the mirror responded, and Adam realised belatedly that the man had never seen the object in action before.
It's just magic,
he explained quickly.
Henry laughed nervously. Just magic? Of course it is.
Then a moment later, he seemed to pale.
Oh, wow. He's even bigger than me.
Adam frowned, taking the mirror back from him and forcing himself to look at the image. An enormous man sat at the table, shoveling down what couldn't have been less than 6 scrambled eggs. He had sleek black hair, a deep cleft in his chin, a look in his eyes like he couldn't wait until the next chance to kill something.
No!
Adam gasped in shock. He suddenly saw the flash of a blade in the shadows, heard the heavy footfalls of a hunter's approach.
You're nothing but a beast.
He grabbed the old wound in his leg, shaking his head.
This has to be a mistake,
he thought, sucking in a breath.
No, show me Gaston, he clarified. From Molyneux, the one who hurt Belle.
The mirror flashed again, but the image remained the same. Adam's eyes grew wide, hands trembling in fresh anger.
You recognise him, my lord?
Giles asked in surprise.
Adam gripped the mirror harder. He's the hunter who shot me! Good God.
Adam.
Giles breathed. That deranged, murderous son of a...
Adam started, trailing off.
If I'd have known it was him, I'd never have let Belle get near that place. Damn it! It's a wonder she wasn't 10 times as frightened of him. My prince,
Henry said nervously.
I can still try and take him in if you... No, Adam said fiercely. No one goes near him. He's too dangerous.
He paused, frowning deeply.
And don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Belle already feels bad enough about what happened. There's no point in worrying her more.
Giles hummed. Perhaps. Though, we should heighten our guard near the trail all the same.
If he knows of your existence, he might be able to track her that much more easily. But he shouldn't be able to connect her to me.
Adam said.
Belle promised not to speak a word of us to anyone. Besides, he never did locate the castle before. Though if he does, I'll meet it myself, Adam thought darkly, grinding his teeth.
He wasn't fully grown when he had first met the man. But now, Adam was convinced he could take him out without trouble should he come again. Gaston might be powerful, but he wasn't 8 feet tall with a set of sharp claws and the bulk of 2 brown bears. He stared down at his sharp claws, deciding no weapon would be quite as satisfying to use against the brute as his bare hands.
Show me again.
The mirror stalled a bit before a bit of light flickered into its reflection. The image of Gaston appeared for half a second before disappearing once again. There was no way Adam could have seen where he was in such a short time. He shifted his weight where it sat on the balcony, perched against the outside of the west wing. He had been asking the same question with increasing frequency over the days since his discovery. It seemed like even the enchanted object was growing tired of his antics.
Look, I know,
he sighed.
Maybe this is getting obsessive, but if he decides to come here, it would only take him a couple of hours to do so.
The mirror remained quiet, as though defying him. Adam scrunched up his face.
I'm arguing with a hand mirror,
he realised in chagrin. Of course, speaking with household objects was nothing new to him. He wondered if he'd still do it after the coast had broken. He frowned but plodded on.
I have to make sure. Please?
He asked, thinking he'd try mimicking Belle's efforts to be polite towards the object. It responded at last, letting the image linger. Gaston had a girl on each side of his bare chest, tucked into a large bed of messed up sheets. Adam made a sound of disgust, sticking his tongue out and looking away.
I should have listened to you,
he admitted. The mirror flashed once more, showing a crowd breaking into a grand applause. Adam rolled his eyes.
Very funny.
He set the object down, leaning onto his knees, and staring at the woods beyond for a long minute, before getting an idea.
Tell you what, how about you just warn me if he enters our woods? Can you, do that?
He asked, looking back to the mirror. It flashed again, showing a British redcoat standing and saluting with great animation.
I'll take that as a yes,
Adam decided, picking up the mirror and pulling a small cloth from his pocket. He wrapped it carefully around the glass before tucking it back into his belt. Even though the enchanted object had proved more than useful, part of him still wondered about it. The enchantress herself had given it to him, after all. Still, he couldn't help but feel like the mirror was somehow on his side. He huffed, shaking his head at himself. That certainly didn't make any sense, and like the other reflective surfaces in the castle, he'd rather keep the reflection covered when he wasn't using it. Just in case.
One room, good sir.
The old guard looked up, an enormous man with a thick chin and several weapons slung over his shoulder, standing before him.
Lad, this is a prison,
the guard said in annoyance. I know, the young man said with an air of pride, digging a thick hand into his pocket and producing a small pouch. He tossed it to the guard, who opened it to reveal several shining gold coins. The guard's eyes grew wide, looking back up at the man before him. He hummed, biting one of the coins before cinching up the pouch again. How long did you want it for? The lad dropped another, heavier pouch into the guard's hands.
Till I get word,
he said vaguely. The guard raised a brow. Don't get no meal in it. Don't get no mail in here, son.
That won't be a problem.
Shrugging, the guard pocketed the bribe and unlocked the front gates. I'll have to take those weapons, though, Monsieur
Legume,
the young man said, stepping inside. He shrugged off a shotgun, bow and quiver, and a large knapsack that clanked heavily against the floor. But you can just call me Gaston. Adam sat awake beside the fire in his room, watching as it burned low. He had been kept awake by the raging storm outside, winds rattling his balcony doors and thunder rumbling in the distance. It was especially loud to his ears, though he had always found the sounds of storms strangely calming. Tonight, however, he could only wonder about the woman who slept one room away. Next time. Did she want him to come back? She had been doing better. So much so they decided to have the delayed dinner the following night. Still, he had been wondering about her each night since the one they'd spent together, wondering if she was all right in there alone, if she was still having nightmares, if she really meant what she had said about a next time. Wondered so much, in fact, that he had sat awake, late each night, listening for the soft click of the hidden door to her room. As if in answering his thoughts, the very sound he had been waiting for rang in his ears. Adam was on his feet and flew across the space in an instant, pulling his own hidden door open and looking down into wide hazel eyes. "Sorry," Belle rasped, eyes full of the lingering fear of her dreams and a deeper longing than he'd ever seen in them before. "Hi."
"I'll come,"
he said quickly, letting her guide him back to her soft bed. They settled down beneath the thick blankets, Adam taking care to leave his feet exposed, falling silent and listening to the sounds of the storm. Yet, even here, with Belle in his arms, his thoughts turned to Molyneux. Adam scowled in the darkness, his chest growing tight.
"Adam?"
She pulled back a little. "Is something the matter?" He grimaced. Good grief, but she was perceptive.
"It's nothing."
She raised a brow at him.
"Nothing you need to worry about, at least," he amended.
Her brow only rose further at that.
He sighed deeply. "It's just... I found something out about Gaston," he said with reluctance. "I thought you wouldn't want to hear anything else about him after..."
"What is it?" she prodded. He frowned.
"I've met him before," he admitted.
Her eyes grew wide and she bolted upright. "What?" she cried, looking down at him in fear. "When? How?" Adam sat up slowly.
5 years ago, he was hunting on our grounds, and I approached him for help. And, well..."
He cleared his throat in discomfort, distant thunder rolling through the quiet air.
"He seemed to think me a desirable hunting trophy."
"Sacre Dio!" Belle swore, something she rarely did. You talked to him, and he still attacked you?"
"Are you surprised?"
"No," she said, wrinkling her nose in disgust. "No, I'm not." She stared away for a moment, before sucking in a nervous breath. "Did he hurt you?"
He
started, grimacing. "He did!" she cried, her eyes falling where his hand rested on his thigh. He hadn't even realized he'd been rubbing it. "Oh, Adam!"
"Belle, it's all right. I took an arrow to the leg, but Matthias fixed it up. I hardly notice it anymore."
That didn't seem to appease Belle at all. If anything, she looked more upset, biting her lip hard and running her fingers fretfully across her scalp. Adam sighed. This was exactly why he hadn't wanted to say anything.
"I was a lot smaller then," he explained. "Still a lanky teenager. If he came around again, I'd have no trouble with him."
"You don't understand," she went on. "He saw something. My notebook. He took it before I could stop him. Saw my drawings of the castle, the servants." She paused, putting her knees to her chest and looking away. "And a likeness of you."
"And you think he recognized me?" he inferred.
She shrugged. "I don't know. Perhaps." Adam hummed thoughtfully.
"It's all right," he said after a moment. "Giles is already heightening the guard on the path, in case he finds his way here. In fact," he said, narrowing his eyes and feeling the corners of his nose wrinkle in disgust, "I hope he does, so I can give him what he deserves." A strange expression crossed Belle's face at that. "Adam," she said carefully, "I don't mind that you're angry. I mean, I'm angry. But just don't..." She bit her lip, looking up at him from the darkness. "Please, don't let your anger make you act the way he would." Adam felt a twinge of guilt, recalling the increasingly violent thoughts he had been having towards the man. He pursed his lips and nodded. "I won't," he promised. They settled back down then. Adam realized he felt better now that Belle knew what had been weighing on him in the past few days. "I'm just so glad you're right," she said a moment later.
wrapping one arm as far around him as it would reach. "He's such a monster."
"And I'm not,"
he teased. "Not even a little bit." Adam's chest filled with warmth.
"Ah, come on," he said, hiding a smile as he rested his head atop hers. "I thought I was pretty scary."
He had a quiet snort. "You're only scary when—" She paused, yawning and nestling close to him. "When you try to be."
"I think you've just gotten used to me," he whispered.
Belle's eyes remained closed, but he caught her small smile in the darkness. God, she was so sweet and so wonderful, and Adam felt as if he didn't confess his feelings soon, he was going to drown in his love for her. "Well then, tell her now!" that voice in his head demanded. Adam's eyes grew wide, and he sucked in a nervous breath.
"No, I'm not ready yet,"
he told himself. Tomorrow. He was going to tell her. Tomorrow. After dinner, and dancing, and all that romantic stuff Lumiere had assured him would create the perfect moment. Besides, wouldn't it be strange to change back into a human now, lying in her bed? He suddenly imagined shrinking to the point where his own clothes didn't fit him anymore. Not an inch away from her. He flushed furiously at the thought.
Or what if I don't change back all at once?
He wondered a moment later. The thought of another gradual change, this time in reverse, seemed to draw the blood from his cheeks as quickly as it had entered. That did not sound pleasant, nor something he'd much like Belle to witness. Though he wouldn't pass the enchantress to make every part of this spell as miserable as possible, even the breaking of it. He bit his lip fiercely, suddenly nervous about more than just saying 3 simple words. He hadn't realized until now that it was possible to feel both overwhelmingly excited and terrified about the same thing all at once.
"Belle?"
he managed a moment later, realized he'd been completely lost in the thought of the last minute. When he looked down, however, he realized she had already fallen into another deep sleep.
He smiled. "Good night, la bella la bourse dormant."
He whispered. Sleeping Beauty. He chuckled quietly at his own joke, deciding they'd need to have dinner early tomorrow night, if he was even going to get a chance to tell her how he felt before she fell asleep. Belle pulled open the large wardrobe. The yellow gown greeted her, and she smiled. It was New Year's Eve, and tonight she'd be having the promised dinner with Adam. Her bruises had healed quickly, and they were now but a faint yellow that Madame de la Grande-Bouche promised could be easily covered up by some powder. She pulled the gown down, holding it fondly. She looked at it in secret a dozen times that week, knowing she really had no right to wear such a thing, but wondering all the same. She thought of Adam. Cursed, yes, but still a prince. Maybe, wearing this, she could be like one of the women he would have been with, had his life gone as it should. He doesn't care about that, her heart told her. Still, it might be nice to pretend all the same. She heard a childlike cheer then, glancing down the long windows to her left. She blinked against the bright snow, piled high from the latest storm, then glanced down at the grounds below. Henry was rolling a giant snowball against the ground, and if Belle squinted, she could just see Chip atop his shoulder. She smiled, watching as the father lifted the ball of snow atop another, packing it together in what looks to be the beginning of a snowman. Chip's animated voice floated, muffled through the window. Further across the grounds, Adam moved into her line of view, a shovel resting over his shoulder. He paused along the path, breathing heavily and wiping one arm across his brow. He then turned, looking straight back at her. Belle flushed. He caught me again, she realised, smiling sheepishly and returning his wave as she recalled her first stay at the palace, spying on him and Max playing in the snow. How did he always know when she was watching? Quickly tucking the dress behind her and out of sight, Belle brought her fingers to her lips and blew him a kiss. Adam, grinning ear to ear, reached out as though catching something in the air. He brought the paw to his face, pressing it against his cheek. Belle, in spite of herself, giggled. Adam's distant shoulders shook with amusement. Feeling twice as happy as she had before, Belle turned away, looking back down at the dress in her hands and running her thumbs against the smooth, satiny cloth. Sucking in a breath, she draped the gown over one arm and headed into the hall. 10 minutes later, she had made it to one of the lower levels of the East Wing. Mrs. Potts, Sophie, and Madame de la Grande-Bouche waited for her. Belle greeted them, chewing her lip as she held up the gown with some trepidation.
"Ah, yes, a beautiful gown indeed," the wardrobe declared before Belle could even explain. "Oh, I can just recall when Queen Marie wore that one. What an image she was in it! Though I should warn you, dear, that it is a bit outdated."
"Outdated?" Mrs. Potts said in disbelief. "It's a classic." "Besides, you realise everything in your drawers probably went out of style years ago, right?" Sophie pointed out.
The wardrobe gasped in horror. "Sacrebleu!" she cried. "You are right!"
Belle ignored them, having moved towards the three-way mirror in the corner for the fitting room, gazing at the dress as she held it against her. She didn't know what it was, but something about tonight felt important. Adam had certainly been acting different, the closer it came. Oddly nervous at some moments, playful and giddy at others. It was just a dinner, wasn't it? Do you think I could just try it on?" she asked, turning back to the others. "I know I shouldn't wear it, but—" "Of course you should!" the wardrobe cried. "Such beautiful clothes, sitting unworn for a decade. It is a crime, I tell you." "Here," Sophie said, moving over and taking the gown from Belle's hands. "You're going to need some help getting into this one." Several moments later, Belle felt the top of the criss-crossing ribbons running up her back, finally starting to tighten beneath Sophie's cool fingers. She looked down, touching the soft, pretty ruching of the skirt as she waited. "Done! Let's take a look!" Sophie said excitedly. Stepping out from behind the screen, Belle flushed. About a dozen other women had wandered in while she had been changing, their chatter giving in to expressions of delight as she moved towards the mirrors. Belle stepped forward and blushed further. What looked like a noblewoman stared back at her. Was this really her? She touched the gentle sweetheart neckline, which swept across her chest and framed each shoulder. It didn't show too much, like she'd worried, revealing her shoulders in a way that was flattering, but not so much of her chest that she felt uncomfortable. In truth, she just felt really beautiful. Smiling wide, Belle spun in front of the mirror, the skirts flowing like water before settling back into place. They seemed to shimmer, even in the modest lighting of the room. "Okay, you don't have a choice," Sophie said from behind her, putting 2 hands on her hips. "You're wearing that." Everyone laughed, adding their own affirmations. "Will you believe how well it fits? And look how it brings out her eyes." "It's like it was made for you, love," Mrs. Potts observed. So what to do with your hair?" Sophie went on, lifting Belle's loose strands from the back of her neck and holding them up in several ways as she mused. "And makeup!" the wardrobe exclaimed. "Ah, shoes and accessories, of course. Ah, I have just the perfect thing," she proclaimed, throwing open her cupboards and digging into one of the drawers. Several others spoke up as well, and soon the room was full of a bustle of ribbons and shoes and powder as decisions were made all around her. Belle chuckled, quickly realizing she was unlikely to have any say about the rest of this. That suited her just fine. She'd have gone to dinner in her work boots that night, if it meant just getting to wear this dress. Adam sat at the vanity in his room, staring into his lap while scissors snipped at the fur around his head. The mirrors were gone in this part of the castle, but even if one had been there, he would have avoided it. Frankly, he felt like a fool.
This isn't going to change anything,
he huffed, staring at his freshly filed claws. My lord, give us a chance, Lumiere said gaily, directing the coat rack behind him to make a couple more snips. He felt the strands being pulled into a ribbon a moment later, and grimaced. It had been a while since he had had his hair tugged out so much. Well, fur in this case. There we are, your highness. Adam stood, moving back towards the bed, where black trousers, a deep golden vest, and a lightly embroidered royal blue waistcoat lay carefully atop the bedspread. The colour looked eerily similar to the curtains of the bleu room, or perhaps what used to be the curtains of the bleu room. Even with alterations, it had been nearly impossible to fit him into any ordinary clothes in the past few years. His everyday clothes usually consisted of 3 or 4 of his father's old ones, unstitched and sewn back together to fit him. This, however, had clearly been cut straight from whatever fabric had been confiscated for the task. Pulling on the trousers and a clean shirt, he slid his arms through the vest, tying the cravat as best he could, then pulling on the formal coat with the aid of his valet, wondering if it would still fit him tomorrow. He sucked in a breath. Tonight's the night. The valet, despite the fingers made of wooden knobs, managed to fix Adam's poor attempt at securing his necktie. Then he straightened his jacket and placed a lean arm against Adam's shoulder.
You're ready, my prince,
the man said warmly. He had been the same servant to help him dress as a child. Still here, like everyone, after all these years. A man of few words, but still on his side.
Thanks, Bartholomew.
As Adam turned towards the door, the man cleared his throat from behind him.
And, my lord?
Adam turned back, raising a brow.
Should you find the need, the man said straightly, those pants can tighten quite significantly.
Adam, in spite of himself, laughed.
I may very well need them to,
he admitted, though his heart raced at the thought. Following Lumiere into the hall, Adam tried to calm his heart as they passed the ancient paintings of the West Wing and entered the lower floors of the castle. Here, a few mirrors lined the walls, and he finally dared to look at his reflection.
Hey,
he said, stopping and staring at himself straight on.
Hey, I don't look so bad,
he exclaimed, starting to smile. Lumiere grinned. What did I tell you, my prince? Adam turned his head this way and that.
Not bad at all,
he said, surprised at himself. He stood tall, holding his collar in mock pride.
A real king of the jungle, no?
My lord, Adam laughed again. It seemed easier to joke about himself now. Now that he felt so sure he wouldn't be this way forever. He hurried off down the hall towards the grand staircase. He paused just beyond the entrance, noticing Cogsworth waiting at the threshold. The man went cross-eyed for a moment, checking his clock face. Ah, just in time, my lord, he said, pushing open the door with no little effort, then resuming his formal posture and motioning towards the door. Your lady awaits. Sucking in a breath, Adam straightened his cravat once again, stepping out into the western landing. Across the way stood its eastern counterpart, both stairs leading down and joining in the centre. He suddenly recalled the days long past, where he would descend these steps hand in hand with his mother, meeting Papa on the other side, before turning to meet an assembly of guests. It was like another life, completely. One he never thought he'd experience again. But here he was. And though no crowds were there to greet him, someone did await him on the other side. His greatest friend in the world. the woman he had given his heart to. And while he had grown accustomed to her presence, in this moment he suddenly remembered just how impossible it all really seemed that she had found her way here, to him. He finally looked up and felt his chest swell beneath him. She looked a vision in that yellow gown, not unlike the sun itself as it rose in the east. His sun, the light chasing away the darkness that had so nearly consumed him. Across the way, Belle smiled a little shyly, offering an inconspicuous half wave in his direction. Adam laughed warmly, smiling wide. It took all he had not to bound down the steps at the sight of her. Instead, he forced himself to straighten, moving down the steps as she did the same. At the bottom, he stopped, bowing low.
Mademoiselle Dupont,
he said deeply, grinning a bit as he looked back up at her. Belle appeared utterly tickled at that, sweeping into a curtsy of her own. Prince Adam. Knowing a few servants were watching, they tried not to chuckle too loudly. Adam offered his arm, leaning down close.
You are so beautiful,
he whispered, unable to keep it in any longer. It was true in this moment, of course. Hair pulled halfway up into a pretty golden band, the rest cascading down over one gorgeous shoulder. Soft gloved fingers gripping his arm. And the rest of that dress. Just wow. She looked like a goddess. But at the same time, even such an outward elegance seemed to pale in comparison to the person beneath it. Adam had long thought Belle had a beautiful spirit, and anything she wore could only come with a fraction of representing all that she was on the inside. This, however, was just a feeling, one he had not yet found the words for. But even as a pretty blush crossed Belle's cheeks at the compliment, he wondered if she didn't read the deeper meaning in his words. Belle leaned sideways, spotting Adam's form across the way. He was hidden behind the candlesticks lining the long dinner table. "Hello down there," she called in jest. She heard him laugh.
How's your coat au vin? He asked.
Delicious. If a bit lonely, she admitted inwardly. They usually ate together in the kitchen, or sometimes in the library. This was lovely, but she couldn't help but wonder why a formal dinner involved sitting so far apart. A moment later, she heard his chair shift against the floor, then smiled in victory as he lifted it in one paw and his plate in the other, and moved down the length of the table. Behind him, Belle thought she heard Cogsworth mutter something about proper customs, but Adam seemed either not to hear, or to be ignoring the man. Probably the latter.
Much better,
he said, settling beside her. He glanced at her place setting, then into her eyes.
Ah, so you figured out the utensil situation,
he observed as one of the footmen brought over his own set that he'd abandoned. I asked Mrs. Potts, she admitted. She said to start with those on the outside and work in.
Same as Cogsworth told me.
They laughed, enjoying the meal side by side. Adam making a valiant effort to use the formal silverware that was much too small for his grip. By the time dessert was cleared away, the candles had dimmed, and Belle was speaking animatedly about her first lessons with Master Pascal. Adam smiled while she did so, reaching silently for one of her hands, and resting his chin on the other as he listened.
What will be the first?
He asked when she fell silent.
Your first masterpiece,
he clarified, eyes bright.
What will it be?
Belle smiled, shaking her head at him. She reached up to tuck a lock of hair behind her ear, but found none, each strand already gathered carefully away from her face. I don't know about masterpiece, but I'd certainly like to paint the valley, she admitted, resting her hand on the back of the table. From Maple's Peak, of course. He smiled, like he knew something she didn't.
Why there?
He asked softly. Belle sucked in a breath at the question. She thought of the cliffside overlooking the lake, the forested hills covered with snow, a warm presence beside her. It was the place where she learned his name, where she learned about his past, where she had made her first real friend, where everything had started. You know why? Belle breathed. Her heart beat once, twice. That deep, warm feeling she'd been feeling for more and more these days, threatening to burst forth. Adam held both her hands now. She hadn't even noticed it happen. Music started floating into the room, and his ears perked up.
Come on, he said. The night's not over yet.
It isn't? Belle asked, though she wasn't entirely surprised. He had obviously been up to something. Now she was just going to find out what. She bit her lip excitedly as Adam pulled out her chair and led her into the hall. They followed the notes to the ballroom, where 2 footmen coat racks stood, bending all the centres before pushing open the doors and let them inside. Oh! Belle gasped, bringing her hands to her cheeks in surprise. She'd been in this room a few times, but it had always been dark and dusty over years of disuse. Now every square inch of it sparkled, the grand chandelier bright against the tall, domed ceiling. Enormous windows looked out into the dark forested hills. Something shifted beside her then, and Belle looked back to see Adam facing her, one paw upright in an invitation, and the other placed beside his back.
May I have this dance?
He asked formally. Belle's eyes grew wide and bright. Really? A tiny, playful grin crept over his face.
Really?
Belle's smile, in contrast, was unrestrained. She rested her hand in his, feeling a blush cross her cheeks, and let Adam guide her into the room. No wonder Mrs. Potts was so insistent on the more comfortable shoes, she realised with a mix of amusement and excitement, catching a change in the music as they stopped at the very centre of the floor. A waltz. She smiled wider, her hand shifting in his as he turned to face her. Adam's paw came to rest against her back then, so large it nearly encompassed her whole waist, and he stepped forward, pulling them close. Just as she reached up to rest her own hand against his arm, they were off. This was nothing like dancing with Papa in their small kitchen. Adam held her gently, yet firmly, guiding them in long, graceful sweeps across the floor. At times, he would just barely lift her from her feet, and she wondered if they weren't gliding on air. Within minutes, they had already covered the entire room, and Belle found it impossible to repress her growing smile, especially when he would twirl her around and bring her close once again. As the song neared its end, she gasped as he dipped her low.
Would it be too formal of me to ask you for another?
He asked, eyes dancing. He looked thoroughly pleased with himself. Belle laughed, clinging to him as she dangled near the floor, though she felt little fear of falling. Well, seeing as I am previously unasked for, you may, she quipped. He chuckled, lifting her up quickly and off her feet. She cried out in surprised delight as he spun them both beneath the grand chandelier. He held her fast against his side, and she held the edge of her skirt, its pretty fabric flowing behind as they turned. The music slowed then, the melody unfamiliar but poignant, filling Belle's chest with a feeling of wonder. Adam slowed too, still holding her close. The mirth had left his eyes, replaced by something more she had yet to understand. She let the hem of her dress fall from his fingertips as he lowered her back to her feet. Neither returned to the waltz, both momentarily forgetting the steps as the candles around the room began to dim of their own accord. Adam's fingers caught against hers again, pulling them close to his chest. She rested her head there too, and close together they swayed to the soft notes filling the darkness. Belle wasn't sure how long the music lasted, but she wished it would never end. Not with the way Adam was holding her, the way they drew closer with each breath, the way he brushed her hair aside so the tip of one careful finger could trace the skin of her shoulder beneath. No, she was feeling things she had never felt before, and she didn't want it to stop. Yet the song did, inevitably, come to an end, and a calm quiet filled the large space. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Their breaths were deep, but not from the dance. Adam shifted first, looking around at the living candlesticks flickering along the walls, the coat racks now letting the strings of their instruments go still. He looked back down, lifting her hand from his chest to his lips and barely brushing the back of her hand against them.
I have something to show you,
he whispered. Belle could only nod, still overwhelmed by the moment, the back of her hand tingling where he had kissed it. It was the first time he had done so, and she couldn't help but wonder what more would happen if he didn't have fangs to worry about. Arm in arm, he led her towards the tall windows. Another coat rack stood there, their cloaks hanging from one of his limbs. Adam helped Belle into hers, then pulled his own on, before leading them out of the glass doors to the balcony. Belle braced herself for the freezing air, but was only met with a cool breeze.
A warm front,
he said, as though reading her thoughts,
and a clear sky following the storm yesterday. The timing couldn't have been more perfect.
Perfect for what? Belle asked, unable to hold back her curiosity. He just smiled, guiding them towards the edge of the balcony and down a hidden set of steps that led towards the gardens below. At the base stood Olive, already saddled, a lantern hanging from a hook on the wall that glowed against the dark night air. Adam reached down and lifted Belle onto the horse's back. She sat side saddle, smiling as he made an endearing attempt to smooth out her skirt that had been scrunched up in the process. He stepped back a moment later, sweeping aside his cloak and pulling out the enchanted mirror from his pocket.
Any wolves nearby tonight?
The mirror remained blank. He nodded in satisfaction, tucking it back into his belt before pulling the lantern from the hook beside them with one paw. He reached for the reins with the other.
Let's go, Olive,
he said quietly. They moved throughout the garden, across the courtyard, and out of the eastern gates. The path had been shovelled since the snowfall, and Belle suddenly realised what Adam had been up to earlier. As they turned towards the south, she also realised where they were going. "The peak?" she asked, puzzled. "But it's so dark out. We won't be able to see anything."
Not true,
Adam said simply, nodding to his guards lining the trail. Several more lanterns spotted the pathway as they moved up the narrow slope. The forest was still, the vegetation beginning to thin the higher they climbed. As they broke through the last of the trees, Belle sucked in a breath, realizing what they had come to see. Framed by the dark valley outside, the full dome of the sky became visible. It was filled with a bright ocean of stars. Belle brought a hand to her chest. She had seen the stars from Molyneux, of course, but never so many all at once. And never from so high. They felt so close. She almost wondered if she couldn't touch them. She reached up on impulse, hands dark against the heavens above. A warm presence was beside her then, Adam's arms reaching around the saddle. He leaned against her shoulder, humming deeply.
Do you like it?
She nodded, wondering if her heart wouldn't burst. It's glorious!
Let's stay a while then,
he went on simply. She finally looked down then towards the place he had set the lantern. The snow had been cleared here, too. Several thick quilts lining the ground, and what looked like a small steaming thermos resting in the snow. Her chest swelled further, and she let Adam lift her from where he sat. He didn't set her on her feet, however, but held her bridal style, and crossed the remaining length of snow-covered earth before setting her carefully on the bed of blankets.
I promised the madame I wouldn't ruin your shoes,
he explained warmly.
Also,
he paused, moving back the way they had come, and pulling something from Olive's saddlebag before returning to her side.
Mrs. Potts was worried your feet might get cold,
he said, holding out a pair of thick stockings. Belle chuckled, slipping off her heels and slid her toes into the woolen socks. Did everyone know about tonight but me? He dimmed the lantern before setting down beside her.
Perhaps,
he admitted, producing another thick quilt from the darkness and pulling it over them. His legs drew up on either side of hers, arms sliding beneath the blanket and wrapping themselves around her torso as he rested his head on her shoulder. She hummed, leaning into his cheek and gazing at the skies above. It truly was glorious, and so vast. Strange how someone as insignificant as her in the grand scheme of things could feel so much. Where did she fit in it all? Where did they fit in it all? Adam? He breathed deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever wonder what's out there? He hummed, following her gaze back to the stars above.
Yes.
Before he could say more, something flashed in the darkness. Belle gasped, and Adam pulled back quickly.
It's the mirror,
he realized, pulling it from his belt and looking at it quickly. He relaxed a moment later, however, and held it out before them. Belle cradled it in her hands, staring into its image of a mysterious, beautiful array of light and shadow. What is it? She asked in awe. Adam's hands rested atop her own, watching the glowing glass from over her shoulder. He was quiet for a long minute, the image changing to reveal a strange cloud of colours and stars against a sea of black.
It's the heavens.
Belle looked back at him, eyes wide before staring back at the reflection. Could it really be? Adam was still, barely breathing for a long moment.
I didn't know it could show us.
He trailed off, clearly as overwhelmed as she was. Instead, they remained silent, pressed close, watching the wonders of the universe unfold before their eyes. Grand clusters of stars, bright red suns, enormous spheres of light and clouds and ice, things no words yet existed to describe, things never seen before by man. When the mirror finally darkened, both turned their eyes upwards once again, knowing more of the mysteries above and all the more overwhelmed by what they saw. Belle felt Adam's heavy breaths against her back, her own chest flooded with wonder. She blinked away tears. That was... She started, sucking in her breath. That was beautiful. Adam only nodded. He set the mirror aside, then reached for her good shoulder, turning her gently to face him.
Still, he said deeply, you're more beautiful than it all.
Belle watched him, unbreathing. Somehow she still felt like he wasn't talking about what she looked like at all. Somehow, the way he said it seemed to mean something else. Adam searched Belle's eyes. Did she know what he meant? Did she know when he said she was beautiful that he really meant so much more? Maybe she did, but it didn't matter. He had to tell her himself.
Belle,
He said. He swallowed, reaching for her fingers. He felt his own tremble, but couldn't seem to calm them. He swallowed again, staring at their hands as he spoke.
are you happy here? With me?
He asked quietly. Gentle fingers brushed his cheek, and he looked up quickly. Belle looked at him with soft eyes. You know I am, she whispered. The quaking in his hands ceased. His fear cast away in an instant. He ran his knuckles over her cheek, fingers trailing down the soft skin of her neck. Belle sighed, eyes fluttering shut for a moment. He reached up again, cupping her face in his paw, fingers in her hair. She leaned into it, one small hand resting on his as he gazed back up at him longingly. This was the moment. He knew it. And suddenly, he wasn't nervous. Suddenly, he had never felt so sure of anything. He leaned close, gripping her fingers with his free hand, heart full of more love than he'd ever felt in his life.
Belle,
He breathed.
I...
Say one more word, and she's dead.
Adam froze.
His skin crawled head to toe, the fur on the back of his neck standing on end. Unbreathing, he looked up slowly. A pair of eyes watched him from the dark trail. Blood red eyes. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one because oh my god, that was a long one. And sweet mercy, that was something else. Okay, so Cersei's got Maurice and interrupting their night. Great. Thanks, you witch. Anyway, that night, the Beauty and the Beast sequence, the dance, and when all the ladies get together with Belle and Adam not feeling ugly in his own fur, and just the sheer emotion described in that is beautiful, isn't it? So beautiful. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.